Chris had never been the type to obsess over lawn care. He was more of a let it grow and mow it when it gets out of hand kind of guy. But when he moved into his new home in Pine Ridge Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood tucked away from the bustle of the city, he knew he'd have to adjust to a different way of life. The houses here were pristine, each with perfectly manicured lawns, tidy flower beds, and fresh coats of paint. Every yard looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. As a digital marketing consultant who worked from home, Chris didn't mind the peace and order of the place. He'd grown tired of the chaos and noise of the city and craved a more tranquil suburban lifestyle. But even in this quiet haven, there was a catch. The Homeowners Association, HOA, Pine Ridge Estates was ruled by a strict HOA, and word around the neighborhood was that the board was relentless in enforcing its rules. It was the kind of place where every blade of grass had to be in line, and any deviation from the established aesthetic was met with swift action. Chris wasn't the type to care about lawn rules, but he knew better than to rock the boat. He figured if he followed the basics, mow the lawn, keep the trash cans out of sight, and maybe plant a few flowers for good measure, he'd stay under the radar. And for a while, it seemed like the plan was working. Chris settled in, spending his days working from home and his nights getting to know his neighbors, who seemed friendly enough. The idea of spending weekends in his new backyard, enjoying the solitude, started to grow on him. But that peaceful image of suburban bliss would soon be shattered by a piece of paper that would change everything. One bright Monday morning, as Chris sipped his coffee by the window, he noticed something strange. A crisp envelope was wedged under his front door. At first glance, it looked like one of those generic mailers from local businesses, maybe an ad for landscaping or window cleaning. But when he bent down to pick it up, he saw the official Pine Ridge Estates HOA seal embossed on the front. Curiosity piqued, he opened it quickly. Inside was a formal letter with bold underlined text. Notice of violation. Lawn maintenance violation. Chris blinked, rereading the letter twice. According to the HOA, his lawn was in violation of the community's strict standards. The letter listed several reasons, most of which seemed minor to him. There were claims that his grass was too high in certain areas and that there were unsightly patches of weeds visible on the lawn. It also noted that his flower beds lacked the uniform color palette that the HOA preferred, something he hadn't even thought to consider. The fine was listed at $75, with a threat of further penalties if not resolved in the next 7 days. Chris furrowed his brow. His lawn was perfectly fine. He mowed it regularly, and he was certain the weeds were barely noticeable. He glanced out the window again. The lawn did have a few blades of grass poking up higher than others, but was it really that much of a problem? He hadn't exactly cultivated a perfectly manicured golf course-style lawn, but it wasn't unkempt either. As if on cue, the faint sound of a lawnmower whirred in the distance, coming from one of his neighbor's yards. He watched as another perfectly groomed lawn came into view. A quiet, uneasy realization started to settle in. This HOA wasn't going to let him get away with anything less than perfection. $75 for a few weeds? Chris muttered to himself, shaking his head. He felt a knot form in his stomach. It wasn't the money that bothered him, but the principle. He had followed the unspoken rules of the neighborhood. Why was he getting singled out? He put the letter down and grabbed his phone. Time to figure out who was behind this. The next day, as Chris sat at his desk working, he heard a firm knock on the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, but figured it might be a neighbor stopping by to introduce themselves or ask for a favor. He opened the door to find a woman in her late 50s standing there, her arms crossed firmly across her chest. She wore a floral print blouse and a pair of thick cat-eye glasses that gave her an air of both authority and judgment. "Are you Chris Thompson?" she asked in a tone that was half question, half statement. "That's me," Chris replied, slightly thrown off by the formality of her presence. "I'm Karen Richards. I live 2 doors down." "I'm on the HOA board," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked past him into the house. "I wanted to talk to you about the condition of your lawn." Chris blinked. "Okay. What about it?" Karen straightened up. "Well, it's in violation of HOA guidelines, as I'm sure you've already received the notice. Your grass is patchy, you've got weeds growing," and she paused to survey the front yard again, shaking her head. "You've got a few flowers that don't even belong here." Chris was taken aback. "I received the fine, yeah. But I've been keeping the lawn tidy. It's not a mess." Karen didn't look convinced. "You're new here, so I'll give you a pass this time, but this kind of negligence won't be tolerated. We have very high standards in Pine Ridge, and if everyone let their lawns go like this, the whole neighborhood would look like a dump. You need to get that taken care of immediately. Chris had to suppress a smile. It's really not that bad, Karen. I mow it regularly. She scoffed. Regular mowing doesn't mean it's up to par. We can't have your property bringing down the value of the whole neighborhood. Chris could feel his patience thinning. He was already annoyed by the fine, but Karen's smug demeanor only made it worse. The thought of having this woman as the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood aesthetics rubbed him the wrong way. As Karen went on, detailing the small violations and implying that he was some sort of lazy homeowner, Chris was struck by a growing sense of discomfort. She seemed to take an almost personal pleasure in pointing out every little flaw. I'll be back in a few days to inspect, Karen said with finality, her tone making it clear she expected compliance. I suggest you take this seriously. Before Chris could say another word, Karen turned on her heel and walked back down the sidewalk, glancing over her shoulder one last time as if expecting to see his lawn magically transform before her eyes. Chris stood in the doorway, shaking his head in disbelief. This was his first real interaction with someone from the HO, and it left a sour taste in his mouth. He hadn't expected much from his suburban life, but this was something else. After Karen's visit, Chris couldn't shake the feeling of being unjustly targeted. He decided it was time to dig a little deeper into this whole HOA situation. The fine wasn't really what bothered him. It was more about the way Karen had treated him like an outsider, assuming he was just another careless homeowner. He knew something wasn't right, and he was determined to figure out what. Over the next couple of hours, Chris sifted through his documents, eventually locating the HOA's governing bylaws and rules packet that had been handed to him during the closing of his house. It was a hefty read, filled with legal jargon and a whole bunch of guidelines about yard maintenance, architectural integrity, and even the acceptable colors for house trim. As he flipped through the pages, he took notes on the specific requirements for lawns. The bylaws were pretty clear about the aesthetic standards for lawns, but they were also a bit vague when it came to what exactly counted as a violation. In one section, it mentioned that grass should be uniformly green and free of noticeable weeds. The only specifics were about grass length. Anything over 4 inches was deemed unsightly, which was just ridiculous to Chris. He'd always had a more natural approach to his yard. It wasn't perfect, but it was livable. As he scanned further, he found a clause that caught his eye. All HOA positions, including the president, shall be elected by the community and take office on the 1st of the month. A thought hit him like a lightning bolt. Wait a minute, Chris murmured to himself, scrolling through the list of board members that was included at the back of the packet. I don't remember seeing this. There it was, his name, right at the top of the list, under the title of HOA president. The paperwork from the previous owners had been unclear, but after rereading it now, it all made sense. When he had moved into the neighborhood, he had agreed to assume the role of HOA president as part of a rotating system, something that hadn't fully clicked in his mind at the time. He quickly jumped on the HOA website to double-check. Sure enough, there it was, Chris Thompson, HOA president. His jaw dropped. Here he was receiving a fine from Karen, who seemed to think she was the authority around here, when in reality, he was the one calling the shots now. The irony hit him hard. Karen, the self-appointed lawn monitor, didn't even know he had just taken the helm. She had no idea who she was messing with. Chris couldn't help but smirk. The balance of power had shifted dramatically, and he was now in the driver's seat. But first, he had to deal with the fine. He needed to handle this situation the right way, especially if he wanted to avoid stirring up trouble with the other homeowners. The following afternoon, Chris decided it was time to put his newfound power to use. He had already decided to confront Karen about the fine, but he wasn't going to let her know right away that he was the one in charge now. Instead, he wanted to see her reaction when he casually dropped the bomb that he was, in fact, the HOA president. Chris made sure to look the part. He put on a clean, casual button-down shirt and khakis, dressing just enough to seem professional but not too formal. He grabbed the paperwork that outlined the HOA bylaws and fine notices, slipping them into a folder before heading to Karen's house. As he approached her home, he saw her in her front yard, aggressively trimming her bushes with a pair of garden shears. She looked up when she noticed Chris walking toward her. "Oh, it's you," she said with a forced smile, clearly surprised to see him. "Back to talk about that lawn violation, huh?" Chris smiled back, keeping his composure. "Actually, I was hoping we could have a quick chat about that. Regarding the fine you issued for my lawn." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly pleased to see him back under her thumb. Oh, I'm glad you're taking this seriously. You know, the HOA has very strict rules. I don't think you fully understand the importance of keeping up the appearance of the neighborhood. I understand, Chris said, stepping forward. I also understand the importance of following the rules, which is why I'd like to clarify a few things. Karen stopped trimming her bush and gave him her full attention. Oh, do tell, she said, a hint of smugness in her voice. Chris took a deep breath and with a casual tilt of his head, said, You see, Karen, it turns out I'm not just another homeowner here. In fact, I'm actually the HOA president. The very same person who oversees all the rules and enforcement you're so fond of. There was a brief pause. Chris could practically hear the wheels spinning in her head. Karen's mouth opened and closed a few times, as if she were trying to process what he had just said. What did you just say? She stammered, her voice rising slightly. I'm the president of the HOA, Chris repeated, his tone even. The fine you issued was, well, let's just say it's not valid. I've reviewed the bylaws, and honestly, it looks like you've been acting outside of your role. Karen's face turned several shades of red as her shock turned to frustration. How long have you been? This is ridiculous. You can't just. Chris cut her off with a smile. Actually, Karen, I am. So here's the deal. I'm officially dismissing the fine you issued for my lawn. It's not a violation, and frankly, I think you should spend a little more time reviewing the rules yourself. Karen's face contorted with anger. You think you can just. I'm afraid so. Chris interrupted again, keeping his cool. But don't worry, Karen. I'm sure you'll be very good at following the rules in the future. In fact, I'm going to recommend that the HOA board have a little chat about how to ensure the rules are applied fairly to everyone. Perhaps we could make the guidelines more clear so that no one else gets unfairly penalized. Karen stood there, frozen in disbelief, her shears hanging limply by her side. It was clear she hadn't seen this coming. Chris felt a surge of satisfaction, but he knew this was only the beginning. Good talk, he added with a sly grin, turning to walk away. I'll be in touch if I see anything else in violation, Karen. As Chris walked back to his house, he could hear Karen muttering something under her breath, though he didn't care to stick around to hear the full rant. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that not only had he cleared the air about his lawn, but he had also put Karen in her place. She had always prided herself on being the neighborhood enforcer, the self-appointed queen of Pine Ridge Estates. Now she had met someone who actually held the power she had so eagerly tried to seize. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. Chris didn't hear a peep from Karen, and he half expected her to try to rally other neighbors against him, or perhaps start stirring up trouble with the HOA board. But to his surprise, the opposite happened. A few days later, Chris received an email from the HOA's official channel titled, Notice of HOA Meeting. The message was brief. Dear Chris, we've scheduled a special meeting to discuss new initiatives for the neighborhood. We look forward to your participation as the HOA president. Best regards, Pine Ridge Estates OA Board. It was then that Chris realized something had shifted, not just in the balance of power, but in the way the entire neighborhood saw him. After Karen's rude behavior, the other homeowners were likely starting to feel a little uneasy about her authoritarian ways. Chris had quietly, but firmly, established that he wasn't going to tolerate any overreach, and it seemed that message had resonated. When the day of the HOA meeting arrived, Chris arrived early, feeling a mixture of anticipation and pride. He knew he was going to have to do some work to restore fairness in the community, but this wasn't going to be a one-person job. As he entered the community center, he noticed several familiar faces from around the neighborhood. Karen, of course, was seated at the table, but her usual cocky demeanor was noticeably absent. She sat with her arms crossed, glaring at Chris. The meeting kicked off with some standard neighborhood updates, but Chris took the opportunity to address a few key points. He calmly outlined the need for clearer guidelines on lawn care, highlighting the importance of consistency and fairness. He also suggested that homeowners be given more transparency about fines and violations, and that penalties for minor infractions be reconsidered. To his surprise, Karen didn't fight him on any of it. She merely sat there, quietly fuming as the other board members nodded in agreement. Chris could see that her authority had waned significantly in the wake of his bold confrontation. By the end of the meeting, Chris had managed to get the board to agree on several changes. The lawn maintenance rules were now more clearly defined, fines for minor offenses were reduced, and homeowners would receive warning notices before any fines were issued. But perhaps the most important change was that the HOA's power was now in the hands of the homeowners, not just one self-appointed enforcer. As Chris walked out of the meeting, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had faced down Karen, taken control of his role as HOA president, and brought about real change in the neighborhood. The next day, Chris walked past Karen's house again. This time, she didn't glare at him. She simply avoided eye contact, probably still trying to come to terms with her newfound position as just another neighbor, not the neighborhood sheriff. Back at home, Chris stood in his front yard, looking at his lawn, perfectly mowed, with no signs of weeds or patches. He smiled, knowing that he had fought for the right to enjoy his property on his own terms, just like everyone else. In the weeks that followed the HOA meeting, a new sense of unity began to take root in Pine Ridge Estates. The changes Chris had implemented were subtle but effective. People started to feel like their voices mattered, and Karen, once the figurehead of HOA rule, was now just another neighbor in the mix, unable to push her personal agenda without scrutiny. Chris found himself invited to more neighborhood gatherings. People who once kept their distance were now stopping by to chat. It wasn't just about the lawn anymore. It was about something deeper. The community felt more like a place where people could truly enjoy their homes, not one where they had to live in fear of being fined or judged by a self-proclaimed enforcer. Even Karen, though she still had a bit of a sour look on her face whenever Chris walked by, began to respect the changes. She had to admit, at least to herself, that the new policies made sense. The rules were fairer, more reasonable, and everyone was on the same page. One afternoon, Chris was walking through the neighborhood when he noticed Karen working on her front yard. This time, instead of an air of superiority, she seemed almost humble. She waved at him, and though it was a small gesture, Chris could see the shift in her attitude. Maybe she had learned something from the whole ordeal. Maybe she had learned that control through fear and intimidation only goes so far. As Chris walked back to his house, he took a moment to appreciate how much had changed. It wasn't just about his lawn or the fines anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, taking action, and turning things around, not just for himself, but for the whole neighborhood. Chris could now sit back and enjoy his beautiful yard, his peaceful life, and his role as HOA president, knowing he had brought fairness and clarity to the community. And as for Karen, well, she might still be adjusting, but at least she'd learned that power didn't come from a title or a rulebook. It came from treating people with respect and fairness. Life in Pine Ridge Estates was better than ever, and Chris was more than happy to be a part of it.